Most people think work is the safest place to be, but for some, it became the setting of their worst nightmare. What would you do if you were completely alone and heard footsteps, voices, or saw something that shouldn't exist? Tonight, we're sharing 7 of the most disturbing true alone-at-work horror stories, told by the people who lived through them. Some are shocking, others completely unexplained. Watch until the end for the creepiest encounter, and don't forget to subscribe to Black Fears for more terrifying true horror stories. The night shift started the same way it always did: badge in, elevator up, lights already off on floors 2 through 10. He worked IT support for a mid-sized financial firm, and for the past 8 months, closing the building had been his job. Security would sweep the ground floor. He owned everything above that. His routine was simple: ride up to 11, check the server room, walk the floor, ride back down. 45 minutes start to finish, and he was in his car. That Tuesday, the elevator opened on 11 and he stepped into the usual dark. Motion sensors caught him immediately. Lights buzzed to life, column by column, stretching down the long corridor ahead. He liked that part. It felt like the building waking up just for him. He dropped his bag at the server room, ran his diagnostics, logged everything normal. He was walking back toward the elevator when he noticed floor 10 had gone dark. Not the whole floor, just the far end. The section visible through the glass partition that separated the elevator bank from the open workspace below. He stopped and looked down through the angled glass. One moment the lights were on. The next, without any sound, without any motion, off. He told himself the sensors had timed out. Happened all the time. Motion sensors reset after 90 seconds of inactivity. If no one was moving on 10, the lights would cut. He took the elevator down to check anyway. 10 was empty. He walked the length of it, past the rows of empty desks, past the break room, past the glass-walled conference rooms that reflected his flashlight back at him. Nobody. Sensors restored the lights behind him as he moved and killed them again as he left. He logged it as a sensor calibration note. Nothing more. Wednesday night, floor 9 went dark while he was still on 11. He watched it happen through the same glass partition. Then 20 minutes later, he stood at the partition and stared down at the dark floors below him and felt something he couldn't name yet. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of noticing a pattern before you've consciously identified what the pattern is. Thursday, he started watching the access logs. The system the firm used was thorough. Every badge swipe in, out, up, or down was timestamped and recorded. He pulled Tuesday's log first. His own entries were there, clean and expected. And then, below his 11:04 p.m. elevator call, there was another entry. Badge ID, 1047 gigawatts. Time, 11:31 p.m. Action, floor 10, accessed. He didn't recognize the badge number. He ran it through the employee directory and it came back with a name and a photo. A heavy-set man with gray-streaked hair and a mild, somewhat tired expression, the kind of face that disappears into crowds. The man had worked in network infrastructure, past tense. He had died 7 months ago. Cardiac event at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. The obituary was still in the company's internal news archive. The badge, according to HR records, had been deactivated the day after his death. The access log said otherwise. He sat with that for a while. He pulled Wednesday's log. Badge 1047 gigawatts had accessed floor 9 at 11:52 p.m. He had been on 11 at 11:52 p.m. He had been standing at the partition watching floor 9 go dark at 11:52 p.m. His first rational move was to call building security and report a possible badge cloning issue. The security lead, a patient woman who had worked the ground floor for 11 years, listened carefully, asked him to forward the logs, and told him she'd have IT pull the physical reader data in the morning. Physical reader data meant the actual electrical signal recorded at the card terminal. Not just the software log, but the hardware confirmation that a card had been physically presented to a reader. Friday morning, the reader data came back. It matched the software log exactly. A physical card with badge 1047, GW's embedded chip, had been presented to the floor 10 reader at 11:31 p.m. on Tuesday. Not a software ghost. Not a cloned signal. Physical card. He spent 2 hours building alternative explanations. The most compelling one was that the badge had never actually been collected from the man's desk after his death, that it had sat in a drawer somewhere and someone had found it and was now using it to access floors they weren't authorized for. A disgruntled employee, maybe. A cleaning contractor who'd come across it. He brought this theory to HR. HR confirmed that all personal effects, including the badge, had been collected from the man's desk by his wife the week after his death. There was a second theory that the wife had kept the badge and was using it herself. He found this thin but possible. He brought it to security. Security agreed to check CCTV. Friday evening, he was back on 11 when the call came. The security lead's voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Measured. She said they had pulled the elevator footage from Tuesday night. She said the elevator had been called to floor 10 at 11:28 p.m., 3 minutes before the badge swipe, and had traveled up. The elevator footage showed the car arriving at 10. The doors opened. The camera inside the elevator, pointing outward toward the floor 10 corridor, recorded the doors standing open for 11 seconds. Nobody got in. Nobody got out. The doors closed. The badge reader logged the swipe 3 minutes later. He was still processing this when she said, the badge had also been used tonight. He hadn't been told because the alert had only just triggered. Tonight's entry was time-stamped 11:17 p.m. It was 11:19 p.m. He was on floor 11. He looked at the glass partition. Below him, floor 10 was dark. He did not take the elevator. He found the stairwell at the far end of the floor and went down 12 flights without stopping, shouldering through the ground-level fire door into the cold outside air before he'd fully decided to run. He sat in his car in the parking structure for 20 minutes before he could make himself drive. He went back through every log entry over the following week, from home, remote accessed, with the security lead and 2 people from IT on a call with him. They found entries stretching back 4 months. Every Tuesday. Always after 11 p.m. Always moving floor by floor 1 level down per week in the same direction, from the top of the building toward the bottom. By their count, based on the pattern, floor 11 was next. He never went back to the building. He filed his resignation by email and left 2 weeks of PTO on the table and did not explain why, because there was no explanation that worked. The firm replaced him within a month. He doesn't know if anyone told the new person about the logs. He thinks about it sometimes, what the progression meant, where it was going, whether floor 11 being next was a coincidence of arithmetic or something else entirely. He thinks about the elevator footage. Doors open for 11 seconds. The corridor visible and empty. Then doors closed. He thinks about how the man had worked in network infrastructure. About how thoroughly he had known those systems. About how a badge, once memorized, every chip ID, every access tier, every building protocol, might live somewhere other than the plastic card itself. He doesn't have a clean answer. He stopped looking for one. The lights go off behind you whether you're watching or not. The shipment from the overseas facility arrived the same way it always did. 2 flatbed trucks, 43 pallets, shrink-wrapped tight and barcode clean, logged into the system before the drivers had even finished their coffee. He worked graveyard at a mid-sized distribution warehouse on the edge of an industrial corridor. His job was simple in theory. Receive overnight shipments, scan and verify contents against the manifest, stage everything for the morning crew. Alone, quiet, fluorescent. He'd been doing it for 2 years and the repetition had become its own kind of comfort. Same trucks, same pallets, same barcodes. That night the manifest said 43 pallets of automotive components, sealed cardboard boxes, factory taped, shipped from a manufacturing plant overseas. He started at Bay 1 and worked his way down, scanner in hand, moving through the rows with the particular efficiency of someone who has done the same task so many times it no longer requires thought. He was on pallet 19 when the scanner beeped wrong. Not an error exactly, just a mismatch flag. The barcode on the top box read correctly, but the system was showing a weight discrepancy on the pallet. 12 pounds over manifest. He noted it, figured it was a loading error on the origin side, and moved on. Weight discrepancies happened. He'd flag it for the morning supervisor and let them sort it out. He was almost done with his first pass when he opened pallet 31. The boxes on this pallet were sealed the same as every other. Factory tape, clean edges, no sign of tampering. He scanned the top box, got a clean read, and then noticed the corner of something white sticking out from beneath the tape seam on the box's side panel. He almost ignored it. Almost. He worked the tape back with his thumbnail. Folded underneath, pressed flat against the cardboard, was a small piece of paper. Handwritten. He unfolded it and read it standing there under the fluorescent lights with the warehouse perfectly silent around him. It had his name on it. Not his employee ID. Not his job title. His name, first and last, spelled correctly, the way it looked on his driver's license. Below his name, in the same neat handwriting, was his home address. Not his current address. The address he'd grown up in 3 states away, the house his parents still lived in. He stood holding the paper for a long time. His first thought was that it was a joke. A coworker pulling something elaborate. Someone who knew his name, had looked up his background, had somehow gotten a note inside a sealed box from an overseas facility. He went through the list of people who worked his shift and adjacent shifts and couldn't land on anyone who would do this or who could. The factory the shipment came from was 14 time zones away. The boxes had been sealed at origin. He set the note down on his workbench and finished the scan. Because he didn't know what else to do. He flagged the weight discrepancy on pallet 19 in the system. He did not log the note. He told himself he'd decide what to do with it in the morning. He was doing his second walkthrough, checking staging positions, when he found the second note. This one was inside pallet 36, tucked inside the top box. Not under the tape this time, but folded and placed deliberately on top of the components inside, as though whoever had put it there had opened the box, laid the note on top of the contents, and resealed it. He knew it had been resealed because the tape line was slightly uneven, less than a millimeter off, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were already looking. He opened the note. Same handwriting. Same measured, unhurried script. This one had his phone number. Not the number he used for work, his personal number, the one he'd had for 6 years, the one he'd never put on a job application. Below the number, a single line, "You don't know me yet." He called security from his desk phone. Got the answering service because the security office was unstaffed at 3 a.m. Left a message that he thought was calm and probably wasn't. He walked every bay door, checked every lock, confirmed that the only way in or out of the building was through the main entrance where he had badged in at 11. He was alone. He had been alone since his shift started. The cameras confirmed it. He checked the live feeds himself, 6 angles, nothing moving except him. He went back to work because standing still felt worse. The third note was in pallet 40. He found it the same way he found the second, top box, resealed, note placed inside with a precision that felt practiced. He unfolded it more slowly this time, the way you open something when you already know you don't want to read it. His mother's name, his father's name, the town they lived in, the street. Then, below that, in the same calm handwriting that was beginning to feel like a voice. They still have the same car. The silver one. He called his parents at 3:40 a.m. His mother answered on the third ring, frightened and confused, and he told her he was fine, that nothing was wrong, that he just needed to hear her voice. He didn't tell her why. He sat on the concrete floor of the warehouse between pallets 39 and 41 and talked to his mother for 11 minutes while the fluorescence hummed above him and the building held its silence around him like a container. After he hung up, he did not go back to scanning. He thought about the sequence carefully. 3 notes. 3 pallets. They weren't random. 19, 31, 36, 40. Spread across the shipment but not evenly. Not every 5th pallet or every 10th. Placed specifically. Placed in pallets that were 3rd, 5th, and 8th in their respective bay rows. He didn't know yet what that meant, if it meant anything, but the placement had intention behind it. This was not scattered. This was organized. He thought about the manufacturing facility. He had the paperwork in front of him, origin address, facility code, inspection stamps, chain of custody signatures. For signatures total, each with an employee ID from the overseas plant. He photographed everything with his phone and sent it to himself. Then he went back to the first note and photographed that. then the second, then the third. He was photographing the third note when he heard the bay door. Not opening, the doors were all locked, he'd checked them himself. But a sound against the door, like weight pressing from the other side. He crossed the warehouse floor faster than he meant to, grabbed a pry bar from the equipment rack mostly without thinking, and stood 6 feet from bay door 7 listening. Silence. Then the sound again. Not a knock, not a bang. Pressure. Like something leaning. He called the police from his cell phone. He stayed in the center of the warehouse floor, away from all the walls, and he did not move until the patrol car arrived 9 minutes later. 2 officers swept the exterior. Nothing. No one. The loading dock was empty. A dumpster had blown against bay door 7 in the wind. The officer showed him on the security camera feed. A clean shot of cardboard and metal rolling across the dock at 3:58 a.m. He told the officers about the notes. They photographed everything, took the originals, filed a report. One officer, the older one, asked him how the notes could have gotten inside sealed boxes from an overseas facility. He said he didn't know. The officer wrote that down. After they left, he had 40 minutes left in his shift. He did not check the remaining 3 pallets. He staged what he had already processed and left the rest for the morning crew with a note of his own, handwritten, the irony of which was not lost on him, explaining that 3 pallets remained unverified and that there was an active police report that the supervisor should be aware of before proceeding. He drove home as the sky was beginning to lighten. He changed the locks on his apartment that afternoon. He called his parents and told them, this time, enough of the truth that they understood to be careful without understanding why. He filed a formal report with his employer and copied HR and the facility's logistics manager. The investigation into the overseas facility took 6 weeks. What they found, or rather what they told him they found, was inconclusive. One former employee had been terminated 3 months prior for undisclosed reasons. His personnel file had been flagged. Beyond that, nothing. No evidence of how the notes had entered sealed, inspected, factory-taped boxes. No match found for the handwriting in any database they checked. No further contact. He transferred to the day shift. He told himself it was for the hours, which was partly true. What he couldn't explain, and what stayed with him longer than the fear itself, was the phrasing on that second note. You don't know me yet. Not you don't know me. The word yet sitting there at the end like an open door that hadn't closed yet, or a clock that hadn't finished counting. He kept the photographs on his phone for a long time, looked at them less and less, until months passed and he stopped entirely. He still lives at the same address. He still has the same number. Some nights, when his phone lights up with an unfamiliar caller ID at an odd hour, he watches it ring without answering, and he thinks about a pair of hands somewhere. Careful hands, patient hands, hands that knew exactly where to fold the paper so it would stay flat against the cardboard, and he waits for it to stop. It always stops. So far. The long-term care ward smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the particular stillness of people who had stopped moving through the world on their own. He pushed his mop cart through the double doors at 11:15, and the ward greeted him the way it always did, dim, quiet. The soft, rhythmic sound of machines doing the breathing that bodies had forgotten how to do alone. He had worked overnight janitorial at the hospital for 3 years. The long-term ward was his last stop every shift, saved for last not because it was difficult but because it was the easiest. Nobody spilled anything in a room full of people who hadn't moved in months. Nobody tracked mud through a corridor where the only foot traffic was nurses doing hourly checks. He could mop the entire ward in 40 minutes and be clocked out before the first pale light showed through the parking structure windows. He started at the nurses' station, worked outward, moving down the left corridor first, rooms 7A through 7F, before crossing to the right side where the longer-term patients were housed. The ones who had been there the longest were on the right. Some of them had been on this ward for over a year. The staff knew their families by name, knew their favorite music, knew which ones responded to touch and which ones didn't. He knew them too, in the peripheral way you know people when you clean around them for 3 years. He knew their faces. He knew roughly how long each had been there. Room 7B was 3 doors from the end of the right corridor. The woman in 7B had been admitted 11 months ago, following a neurological event that had left her in a state the doctors described as a prolonged disorder of consciousness. She was somewhere in her mid-40s. She had a husband who came every Sunday and sat with her for 3 hours and always left with the particular posture of someone carrying something too heavy to set down. She had a get-well card taped to the wall above her bed. Hand-drawn crayon clearly made by a child, that had been there since month 2. He mopped the corridor outside her room and then stepped inside to do the floor around her bed and the bathroom. He was wringing out the mop near the window when he saw her shoes. She was wearing them, canvas sneakers, the kind with flat soles, pale blue, which was not unusual in itself. Families sometimes brought in personal clothing and shoes for patients, something familiar, something that belonged to the person before the ward. But these shoes were wet. Not damp, wet, the soles carrying visible traces of dark soil pressed into the tread, the kind of mud that came from outdoor ground after rain. And the laces were tied. Neatly, correctly tied, the loops even, the knot centered. He stood looking at them for a moment. Then he looked at the window. The window in room 7B was a casement style, the kind that cranked open with a handle. Hospital policy kept long-term ward windows locked. A simple lever lock above the crank mechanism. The lever on this window was in the open position. He could see the gap, no more than 3 inches, the window pushed out slightly into the night air, the curtain stirring almost imperceptibly in the draft. He did not touch anything. He stood in the middle of the room with the mop handle in his hand and thought very carefully. The woman in the bed had not moved voluntarily in 11 months. Every attending note he had ever inadvertently seen on the corridor whiteboard described her condition as stable and unchanged. She was not walking. She had not been outside. The shoes on her feet, with their outdoor mud and their neatly tied laces, had been put there by someone else. He went to the nurse's station and told the charge nurse what he had found. The charge nurse, a composed, thorough woman who had worked the ward for 7 years, went to room 7B with him and stood looking at the shoes for a long moment without speaking. Then she checked the window, confirmed the lock position, and called the night supervisor. The night supervisor called hospital security. Security came, documented the window and the shoes, photographed both, and asked a series of questions that he answered as precisely as he could. Time of his arrival on the ward. Whether he had entered 7B before or after mopping the corridor. Whether the window had been open when he entered the ward through the double doors. He couldn't say, because the corridor window wasn't visible from the entrance. They removed the shoes carefully, bagged them. They checked the exterior wall below the window. There was a narrow service ledge at the base of the wall. Not a ledge exactly, more the protruding lip of the floor's concrete frame, 4 inches wide at most. Below that, a 12-foot drop to a maintenance pathway that ran between the building and the perimeter fence. Security walked the pathway with flashlights. Nothing. They called the husband. He arrived at 1 a.m. in a coat pulled over pajamas, hair uncombed, face doing something complicated that was not quite fear and not quite hope and was worse than either. He identified the shoes immediately. Yes, those were hers. She had loved those shoes. He had brought them in during month 3 because she had always worn them on Sundays. He had left them in the drawer of her bedside cabinet. He opened the drawer. It was empty. He said he had last visited 6 days ago, on Sunday, and the shoes had been in the drawer then. He said he was certain. He sat in the chair beside her bed for a long time after that, holding her hand, and the charge nurse spoke with him quietly while security finished their documentation. He finished his shift because there was nothing else to do. He mopped the remaining corridor, cleaned the bathrooms, collected the linen bags. He did it all with the particular mechanical autopilot that takes over when your mind is working on something it can't resolve. He thought about the shoes. He thought about the tied laces. That detail would not leave him. Not the mud, not the unlocked window, but the laces. Tied neatly, with care. Whoever had put those shoes on her feet had tied the laces. This was not the action of someone trying to frighten anyone, or of someone in a hurry, or of someone who viewed the woman in 7B as incidental to whatever they were doing. You do not tie the laces of a person you are using. You tie the laces of a person you are tending to. The care in that knot, the evenness of the loops, the centered bow, was the detail that made the least sense and disturbed him the most, because it suggested something about the visitor's relationship to the woman in the bed that he couldn't categorize. He thought about what the visit meant. Where had the shoes come from? The drawer, meaning the visitor knew the room, had been inside before, knew what was in the cabinet. The mud on the soles meant the shoes had been outside, which meant either the visitor had taken them out on a previous visit and brought them back, or the woman had somehow, impossibly, been outside, which the medical staff confirmed was a physiological impossibility given her current condition. He thought about what the visit was. Not vandalism. Not theft. The shoes were returned. Not taken. Not a medical intervention of any kind. The woman had not been harmed. Her vitals through the night had not shifted. The attending physician reviewed her chart in the morning and found nothing inconsistent with her baseline. Someone had come through the window in the middle of the night, retrieved her shoes from the bedside cabinet, done something outside, or brought something of the outside in, and put the shoes back on her feet with the laces tied and left the way they had come. Security installed additional window locks across the entire ward the following week. They reviewed camera footage from the exterior maintenance pathway for the past 30 days. The pathway camera had been offline for routine maintenance for the past 11 days. A scheduled gap that would have been visible in any hospital system accessible to staff, contractors, or anyone with basic knowledge of the facility's maintenance calendar. The investigation remained open. No one was identified. He was interviewed twice more over the following 2 weeks, both times by the same hospital security investigator, and both times he told the same story because it was the only story he had. What he did not tell the investigator, because it felt too thin, too instinctual to include in a formal statement, was what he had noticed about the mud on the shoe soles. He had looked at it closely while standing in the room, before security arrived, before the professional documentation began. The mud was dark and fibrous, the kind that held impressions. And pressed into the mud on the bottom of the left shoe, faint but readable, was a partial pattern. Not a shoe print from the visitor, not a surface texture, but what appeared to be the impression of grass. Blades of grass, pressed flat, still faintly green at the edges. The maintenance pathway below the window was concrete. There was no grass within 40 feet of that window in any direction. He told himself it meant nothing. A detail without a framework is just noise. You can't build a conclusion from a grass impression on the bottom of a shoe when you don't know where the shoe has been. He told himself this and mostly believed it. The woman in 7B died 17 days later. The official cause was documented as natural progression of her existing condition, consistent with her neurological prognosis. Her attending physician signed the certificate without hesitation. There was no indication of outside cause. Her husband was with her when it happened, which the charge nurse told him later, in the way you tell someone a small difficult thing that also contains something merciful inside it. He still thinks about the laces. He has thought about them for 2 years now, and he has still not found the angle from which they make sense. The careful bow, the even loops, the unhurried attention of someone who took the time in the dark in a hospital ward to do that one unnecessary and human thing. He doesn't know if it was an act of love. He doesn't know if that's better or worse. The gas station sat at the intersection of 2 state highways in the kind of place where the nearest town was 20 minutes in either direction and the darkness between those towns was total. He had worked the overnight shift there for 14 months. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. solo, the way rural overnight shifts always were. The work was simple and the solitude had never bothered him. He was the kind of person who did well with quiet, who could spend 8 hours in his own head without it becoming a problem. He had a small television behind the counter that he kept on low, a coffee maker that ran constantly, and a rhythm to the night that rarely changed. A handful of late travelers between 11 and 1. A long dead stretch from 1 to 4. A few early risers after 5, construction workers mostly, men who bought coffee and energy drinks and said nothing beyond the transaction. The woman first came in at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday. He remembered the time precisely because he had just looked at the clock. One of those idle late-night checks you do not because you need to know the time but because the silence has started to acquire weight. He looked up from the clock and she was already inside, which meant she had come through the door without him hearing the sensor chime. The sensor chimed for everyone. He had never once failed to hear it. She was dressed ordinarily. Dark jacket, jeans, hair pulled back, the kind of appearance that described itself and then disappeared. She stood just inside the entrance and looked at him with an expression that was not quite readable. Not distressed. Not hostile. Somewhere in the neighborhood of careful. She asked if the man outside had spoken to him yet. He told her there was no one outside. She looked at him for a moment as if weighing whether to believe that, then nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you something you were hoping to hear but can't quite trust. She didn't buy anything. She thanked him and left. He watched her cross the forecourt, get into a beige sedan parked at the far pump. Engine already running, he noticed, and pull out onto the highway heading east. He went outside immediately after and stood on the forecourt for a solid 2 minutes, turning a full slow circle. The highway was empty in both directions. The access road was empty. The lot was empty. There was nothing near the building, nothing at the edges of the light, nothing in the small patch of shadow behind the ice machine where the security light didn't fully reach. He checked there specifically, because that was where he would go if he wanted to stand near a gas station without being seen from the counter. Nothing. He went back inside and stood at the counter and thought about the question. Has the man outside spoken to you yet? The yet was the part that worked on him. Not is there a man outside or did you see someone outside? She had phrased it as a matter of established fact. The man existed, his presence was known. The only open variable was whether contact had been made. At 3:44 a.m. she came back. Same car, same pump position, same walk across the forecourt. This time the sensor chimed when she entered. He noticed that and didn't know what to do with it. She stood in the same spot just inside the entrance and asked the same question word for word with the same careful expression. He told her again there was no one outside. He asked her if she was all right. She looked at him with something that might have been patience or might have been pity and said that she needed him to take the question seriously. He said he was taking it seriously. He asked her who the man was. She said she didn't know his name. He asked her what the man looked like. She thought about this for a longer moment than the question seemed to warrant, and then she said that the man looked like someone who had been standing in one place for a very long time. He asked her how she knew about this man, specifically at this station, specifically tonight. She opened her mouth, paused, and closed it again. Then she said she wasn't sure how to explain that in a way that would be useful to him. She bought a bottle of water, the only thing she'd purchased across both visits, paid cash, gave him exact change and left. Same direction, east. He called the non-emergency police line after she left and described the situation as best he could to the dispatcher, who listened with the particular neutrality of someone absorbing information they're not yet sure how to classify. The dispatcher said she'd note it and that a patrol unit would drive through when one was in the area. He thanked her and hung up and went back to watching the forecourt. At 5:10 a.m. she came back. He saw the headlights turning in from the highway and knew before she parked that it was the same car. She walked across the forecourt and this time she was moving differently. Her stride slightly off, her arms not swinging quite right, the whole mechanics of her walk carrying the subtle wrongness of someone operating on diminished coordination. She pushed through the door and the sensor chimed and she stood in the same spot and he looked at her and understood immediately that something had changed. She was soaking wet. Not damp, not caught in a light rain. Saturated, her jacket dark with it. Her hair flattened against her skull. Water still running from her sleeves and dripping from the hem of her jeans onto the linoleum. He looked past her through the window at the forecourt, at the highway beyond it. The road surface was dry. The sky through the window showed stars. It had not rained. There was no standing water in the lot. No puddles, no wet asphalt. She was drenched in water that had no source he could identify from where he was standing. He came around the counter. He asked her what had happened. She looked at him with an expression that had moved past careful into something quieter and harder to name. Not fear, but the expression of someone who has accepted a conclusion they've been arguing against for some time. She said she couldn't find the road she came in on. He asked her what she meant. She said she had driven east for a mile and the road had ended and she had gotten out to look and she had been somewhere she didn't recognize and then she had found the road again and come back. He asked her about the water. She looked down at herself as if she had not registered it until that moment. Her hands came up slightly, palms out, in a gesture that contained no explanation. He brought her behind the counter, turned on the portable space heater he kept there for cold nights, found the spare uniform jacket on the hook by the backroom door and gave it to her. He made her sit on the folding stool. He called the police again, non-emergency, and this time said it differently. A woman had returned to his location in apparent distress. Wet, disoriented, unable to account for her whereabouts for the past hour and a half. The dispatcher said a unit would come. While they waited, he talked to her. She answered his questions in short sentences that each individually made sense but did not connect into a coherent account. She knew her name. She knew the date. She knew she had been driving home from her sister's house. She did not know why she had stopped at the gas station the first time. She did not remember asking him about a man. When he described her question back to her, she listened with an expression of careful unfamiliarity, the way you listen to a story someone tells about you from a time you can't recall. The patrol unit arrived at 5:40 a.m. 2 officers, one of whom he recognized from previous overnight stops. They spoke with her for 20 minutes and he gave his account separately. The officers located her car. It was parked correctly at the far pump, engine off, keys still in the ignition. The seat was dry. The floor mats were dry. Whatever had saturated her clothing had not saturated the car she presumably arrived in. The ambulance came at 6:05 a.m. She went without argument, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced from somewhere, still wearing his uniform jacket. She turned at the ambulance door and looked at him with the same expression she'd had on every visit, that careful, weighted look, and said she was sorry for the trouble. He told her it was no trouble. He found out later, through the officer who stopped in the following week for coffee and gave him an unofficial account out of professional courtesy, that she had been evaluated and released. No neurological event. No medical explanation for the gap in her memory or for the water. Her phone showed no activity during the period in question. Her car's GPS log showed the vehicle had not moved from the gas station forecourt between her first arrival and her third. It had not moved at all. He thought about this for a long time. The GPS log was the part that wouldn't resolve. If the car had not moved, then wherever she had gone, whatever road she had driven down and lost and found again, wherever the water had come from, she had not gotten there by car. He thought about the question she had asked him 3 times. The man outside, spoken to you yet? 2 months later, he mentioned it to a regular customer, a retired engineer who stopped in every weekday morning and had the kind of patient, systematic mind that found problems relaxing rather than distressing. The engineer listened to the whole account without interrupting, drank his coffee, and then asked one question. He asked whether the woman had been wet the first time she came in. He said no. Completely dry. The engineer nodded and said nothing more and finished his coffee and left, and the question hung in the air where he had been sitting, and it has been hanging there since because he had never once considered the order of it, that the question she had asked, the man she had described, the road she could not find. All of it had come before the water, not after, and he still does not know what that means. The man outside had not spoken to him yet. He is not certain that has changed. The hotel had 214 rooms, a rooftop bar that closed at midnight, and a phone system that had not been fully updated since the building's last major renovation 14 years ago. He knew the phone system the way you know any infrastructure you've worked alongside long enough, not as a technician, but as someone who had heard its particular sounds for 3 years and understood its moods. The system ran on a private branch exchange, an older model that the parent company had twice approved budget to replace and twice quietly deferred. It had quirks. Certain extensions rang once before connecting. The hold music, a soft, vaguely European instrumental that had probably been selected by someone who no longer worked there, sometimes bled between lines during high-traffic periods, so that if you were transferring a call you might hear 4 seconds of music before the transfer completed. He had stopped noticing these things the way you stop noticing the sound of your own refrigerator. He was working a skeleton crew Saturday. The weekend manager had called out sick, the bellman's shift ended at 10, and by midnight it was only him at the front desk and one maintenance technician somewhere in the building doing a scheduled equipment check. The rooftop bar staff had clocked out by 12:30. The last check-in had been at 11:15. A corporate traveler who had taken his key card without making eye contact and disappeared into the elevator. The lobby was empty and bright and quiet in the way hotel lobbies become quiet after a certain hour. A maintained stillness that felt less like peace and more like held breath. At 1:08 a.m., The phone at the front desk rang. The display read, extension 414. He looked at the number for a moment before answering, because something about it pulled at his memory without immediately resolving. He picked up and said the standard greeting. The line was silent, not dead silent. There was something on the line, a faint presence, the soft almost sound of an open connection. And then, after 3 or 4 seconds, the hold music began to play. The hotel's hold music. The same vaguely European instrumental, playing through the receiver as though he had been placed on hold by whoever had called him. He stayed on the line for 20 seconds, said hello twice more, got nothing except the music, and hung up. He pulled up the extension directory on the desk terminal. Extension 414 was not in the active directory. He searched the full system list, including inactive extensions. It appeared there, flagged in red, status listed as decommissioned, with a decommission date from 3 years prior. The notes field next to the extension read, room taken off inventory. See Facility Management File 2021-09. He knew about room 414 the way all front desk staff knew about it. Not through any formal briefing, because there had never been a formal briefing, but through the sideways transmission of institutional knowledge that moves through a staff over time. A guest had died in that room 3 years ago. The circumstances had been ruled natural, a cardiac event, undisputed. But the room had been taken off inventory afterward, not immediately, but within 6 weeks, and the door had been physically sealed with a secondary lock that required a facilities key rather than a standard master. The official reason given in the staff communication had been a structural assessment, something about the HVAC ducting in that section of the 4th floor requiring extended maintenance access. Nobody had pushed back on this explanation, but nobody had entirely believed it either, in the way that reasonable people can hold 2 things simultaneously, the official account and the texture of what they know without being told. He called the maintenance technician on the radio and asked him to check the 4th floor corridor, specifically the sealed door at 414, and confirm nothing was physically wrong. The technician radioed back 11 minutes later. Corridor clear. Door sealed and locked, secondary lock intact, no sign of access. He thanked him and went back to the desk. At 1:47 a.m., extension 414 called again. He watched the display for 2 full rings before answering. Same silence on pickup. Same few seconds of open line presence. Same hold music beginning at exactly the same point in the track. Not from the beginning, but from what he had calculated during the first call was approximately 40 seconds into the piece. As if the music had not stopped between calls. As if whatever was playing it had simply been waiting. He stayed on the line longer this time. He did not say hello. He listened to the music and thought about the phone system and ran through everything he understood about how a decommissioned extension could generate an active outbound call. The answer was that it couldn't. A decommissioned extension was removed from the call routing table. It had no dial tone, no ring capability, no ability to initiate or receive calls. It was within the system's architecture, the equivalent of a phone that had been unplugged at the wall. He hung up and called the phone system vendor's overnight technical line. He was on hold for 6 minutes before reaching a technician, who listened to his description, asked him to read the extension number twice, and then went quiet for a moment in the way technicians go quiet when something doesn't match their expected parameters. The technician said that what he was describing should not be possible with that system model. He asked the technician to be more specific about should not. The technician said that once an extension was decommissioned in the system's database, the hardware address associated with it was flagged as inactive, and the system would not route any signal, incoming or outgoing, through that address. He asked if there was any scenario in which a decommissioned extension could self-initiate an internal call. The technician said he couldn't think of one. He thanked him, wrote down the call reference number, and sat at the desk in the bright empty lobby and thought. At 2:31 a.m., extension 414 called a 3rd time. He answered on the first ring. Silence. Open line. And then the music beginning in exactly the same place. 40 seconds in, the same bar, as though the piece existed in a loop that only he could hear from this side of the call. He did something he had not done on the previous 2 calls. He put the call on hold from his end, physically engaging the hold function on his desk unit, and walked to the filing cabinet behind the desk where physical facility management records were kept. He found the folder labeled 2021-09 in the third drawer. Inside were 3 documents: the structural assessment memo, a room decommission form signed by the facilities manager, and a separate sheet, an internal incident summary, the kind generated automatically by the hotel's risk management protocol whenever a guest death occurred on property. The summary was 2 pages. He read it standing at the filing cabinet. The guest had been a man in his late 50s, checked in for a 3-night stay. He had been found by housekeeping on the 2nd morning. Natural causes confirmed by the attending physician, consistent with a pre-existing cardiac condition documented in his medical history. No suspicious circumstances. The incident had been handled correctly, reported correctly, closed correctly. He was about to close the folder when he saw the guest's profession listed on the check-in information attached at the back. Hotels retained this information when guests booked through corporate accounts, which this guest had. The corporate account was listed. Beneath it, the company name. Beneath that, the guest's job title: Senior Systems Engineer, Telecommunications Infrastructure. He stood at the filing cabinet with the folder open and read that line 3 times. He went back to the desk and took the call off hold. The music was still playing. He listened to it for a long time, the soft, unremarkable melody that had played in the background of 3 years of shifts, so familiar he had genuinely stopped registering it as something that had been chosen and installed and configured by a specific person at a specific time. He thought about what it would mean to know a phone system, not in the way he knew it, peripherally, experientially, the knowledge of someone who worked near it, but fundamentally, the architecture of it. The routing tables, the hardware addresses, the decommission protocols, the specific and exploitable gap between a software flag that marked an extension inactive and the physical hardware at that address, which remained present in the building, connected to the same copper lines it had always been connected to, sitting behind a sealed door in a room that no one entered anymore. The hold music finished its loop and began again from the top. He listened to the first 40 seconds of it. Then, for the first time in 3 years, he heard those 40 seconds, really heard them, as something someone had put there deliberately. A piece chosen from a catalog. A specific file. Configured by someone who understood the system and had access to it and had been, at some point, a guest in this building. He set the receiver down gently, not hanging up, just setting it on the desk. He could still hear the music from where he stood. He pulled out his personal phone and sat in the chair behind the desk and waited for 7 a.m. with the lobby lights burning above him and the music playing softly from the receiver and the rest of the building holding its silence around him like it was listening too. He requested a transfer to a different property the following Monday. He gave a reason that was true but incomplete. He did not tell his manager about the calls because he had spent the weekend finding ways to explain them that used only systems and signals and hardware, and he had almost succeeded. The gap in his almost was exactly the size of one question he could not close. The system logs, pulled by the vendor technician the following week at his request, showed no record of 3 outbound calls from extension 414 between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. that Saturday. His desk phone showed them in the received call history. One of those records had to be wrong. He had spent a long time deciding which one he could live with. The construction site sat on a ridge above the valley like something half-assembled and abandoned, which was essentially what it was. The project was a mixed-use residential development. 12 buildings planned, 3 framed, none completed. The developer had broken ground 18 months ago with the particular optimism of someone who had not yet learned what winter did to hillside clay, and the project had been running behind schedule since the 2nd month. By November, the site had settled into its winter rhythm. Skeleton crews during the day, nobody at night except the watchman, and the cold coming down off the ridge after sunset with the kind of seriousness that made you understand why nothing had ever been built up here before. He had taken the night watchman position in October. His job was simple: arrive at 6 p.m., do a circuit of the site every 90 minutes, log anything unusual, leave at 6 a.m. He had done this work before at other sites and understood its essential nature. You were not there to stop anything. You were there to observe and report and be a visible presence that made theft or vandalism slightly less convenient. He carried a flashlight, a radio, and a clipboard. He had no illusions about what he was or wasn't. The site covered roughly 4 acres on the ridge. At its center sat the site trailer, a portable office used during the day by the project manager and the structural engineer, locked at night. 3 partially framed building shells occupied the eastern half of the site, their exposed steel skeletons catching the moonlight when there was any. The western half was still raw ground, surveyed and staked but not yet touched, the survey flags in their rows disappearing into the dark beyond the reach of the site's perimeter lights. Along the northern edge sat the equipment yard. A tower crane, 2 bulldozers, an excavator, a compactor, and a line of site vehicles covered in tarps. The crane was fixed. It didn't move between day and night operations. The bulldozers and excavator were parked in specific positions that the day foreman had made a point of logging at the end of each shift, because equipment theft was a real concern on isolated sites and documented positions made insurance claims easier. He noticed the first displacement on his 3rd week. He was doing his 2 a.m. circuit, moving through the equipment yard with his flashlight, when he realized that the nearer of the 2 bulldozers was not where it had been at the start of his shift. He was certain of this in the way you become certain of spatial arrangements when you walk the same ground multiple times a night for 3 weeks. The bulldozer had been parked with its blade facing southeast, and now the blade was facing south. Not a dramatic change. 3 or 4 degrees of rotation, or a short reverse move that had brought the machine back in a slightly different orientation. He stood looking at it for a moment and then looked at the ground around it. The ground in the equipment yard was mud, thick, clay-heavy, the kind that held tire impressions like wet cement. The bulldozer's tracks had left clear marks leading to its current position. He followed the marks back with his flashlight. They came from approximately where the machine had been parked at the start of the shift. The path between the 2 positions was short, less than 10 feet. But it was a path. The machine had moved. He logged it as a possible equipment check by a day crew member who had returned to site after hours, which was irregular but not unheard of. He called the day foreman's cell phone and left a message. The foreman called back in the morning and said no one had been on site after 6 p.m. He checked the site's gate log. The electronic gate at the access road logged every entry and exit by key fob. His own arrivals and departures were there. Nobody else had entered or exited after 6 p.m. on any night since he had started. He thought about this carefully. He thought about it the way you think about something when you're not ready to say the obvious thing out loud yet. He wrote up a formal incident report and submitted it to the site manager and went home and slept and told himself it was a logging error or a key fob that had malfunctioned without registering. The second displacement happened 4 nights later. This time it was the excavator. He found it during his 12:30 a.m. circuit. The machine had moved approximately 8 feet east from its log position, its bucket lowered to a height it had not been at when he arrived. Again, clear track marks in the mud. Again, no gate log entries. He photographed everything with his phone. He called the foreman's emergency line this time rather than leaving a message. The foreman drove out, arrived at 1:15 a.m., looked at the equipment and the tracks and the gate log and stood in the cold with his breath making short clouds and said nothing for a long time. They checked the physical gate. It was locked, chain and padlock both intact, no sign of cutting or forcing. They walked the perimeter fence, chain link 8 feet, topped with a single strand of barbed wire. They found no breach, no section that had been cut and reattached, no area where the ground underneath had been disturbed enough to suggest someone had crawled under. The fence was intact at every point. The foreman said he was going to call the equipment company in the morning and ask if the machines could have experienced any kind of hydraulic drift, a pressure release that could cause slow passive movement in certain temperatures. He said it without much conviction. He left at 2 a.m. and the site settled back into its silence and he did the rest of his circuits alone. Hydraulic drift, when the equipment company's technician came 2 days later, was ruled out for both machines. The bulldozer's displacement required active engagement of the drive system. The excavator's bucket position change required a deliberate hydraulic input. Neither could occur passively. The displacements continued. Every 4 to 5 nights something moved. Never dramatically, never in a way that caused damage or appeared aggressive. The crane rotated 11 degrees, something that required releasing its slew brake and engaging the drive, then re-engaging the brake in the new position. The compactor shifted 6 feet along its own axis. A steel I-beam that had been staged at the edge of the eastern building shell was moved 8 feet to the south and set down with a precision that suggested machinery rather than manual labor. Set down level, square, without any of the skid marks or ground disturbance that a manual repositioning would have left. He began photographing everything at the start of each shift. Documented positions, time-stamped, sent to his own email as a running record. He stopped trying to explain it and started simply observing it. There was a quality to the displacements that he could not articulate to the foreman or the site manager, but that was becoming increasingly clear to him over the weeks. The movements were not random. They had a logic. The equipment was not being moved into random positions. It was being arranged. The bulldozers had migrated over 3 weeks to the western half of the site, away from the eastern building shells. The crane's rotation had redirected its boom away from the southern section of the site and toward the north. The staged steel had moved south, then further south in a subsequent night, away from the northern perimeter. He did not know what the arrangement meant. He thought about it on his circuits, walking the perimeter in the cold with his flashlight cutting a narrow corridor through the dark, and he couldn't find the logic from the inside. He could only see that there was one. He quit in January. He gave the site manager a week's notice and a reason that was true. He had found work closer to home, and did not mention that the displacements had continued through his last week and that in his final circuit on his last shift, at 4 a.m. with the sky beginning to lighten slightly in the east, he had stood in the equipment yard and looked at where everything had ended up and felt something he could not name. Not fear. Something more like standing at the edge of a very large and very quiet thing and understanding that it was larger than the portion of it you could see. He read about the sinkhole in March. It was a brief item in the regional news. Construction site on the ridge above the valley. Development project suspended. Sinkhole had opened in the northern section of the site following a period of sustained rainfall. Significant void structure discovered beneath the surface, old karst formation. Geological survey had apparently not detected its extent. The article included a photograph taken from the access road, the site visible on the ridge, yellow tape, emergency geological assessment team visible in the background. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He had walked that ground. He knew the positions of things in that photograph. And what he could see in the photograph, clearly and without ambiguity, was that the equipment, all of it, every machine that had been methodically repositioned over his 3 months on that site, was on the south and east sections of the site. The sinkhole had opened in the north. The northern section of the site in that photograph was empty. No machines. No staged materials. No stored equipment of any kind. The ground had given way in a section of site that had been, over the course of a winter, quietly and completely cleared. He read the article 3 times and then set his phone down and sat with it for a while. He thought about the movements, the precision of them, the patience of them, the intelligence required to understand not just where the ground was failing but where it was going to fail, and when and how much warning there was. He thought about the months of it, the careful incremental repositioning, the absence of any footprint, the gate log with its unbroken record of no entries. He thought about what it would mean if something had been trying to protect the equipment. Whether that was better or worse than the alternatives. He still doesn't know. He has driven past the ridge twice since reading the article. Both times he has looked up at the site and thought about those circuits, the flashlight, the mud, the silent machines in their new positions, and both times he has had the same feeling he had on that last morning. That whatever had been working up there had not needed him to understand it. Only to stay out of the way. The closing checklist for a big-box retail store had 41 steps and he had memorized all of them in his first 2 weeks. He worked closing shift at a large home improvement store, the kind of place that sold everything from light bulbs to lumber, spread across a floor plan large enough that the far ends of the building felt genuinely remote from the entrance, separated by long aisles that swallowed sound and made the store feel, after the last customer left, less like a commercial space and more like a very organized version of somewhere abandoned. He had worked closing for 2 years. He knew the building the way you know any place you have spent 1,000 nights in. Its sounds, its light quality at different hours, the particular way the HVAC system cycled down after close and the silence it left behind. His coworker had called in sick that afternoon. Not unusual, this particular coworker called in 4 or 5 times a month with the comfortable regularity of someone who had calculated exactly how many absences the attendance policy would absorb. He had covered solo closes before. He knew the rhythm of working the checklist alone, the way you moved faster without conversation but felt the building more acutely, the way the aisles seemed longer when there was no one else in them. He locked the front entrance at 9 p.m., confirmed the last customer was out, and started the checklist at Register 1. The first text came at 9:22 p.m. It came from his coworker's number, the same contact he had in his phone from 2 years of shared shifts, the same number that had sent him memes and shift swap requests and complaints about the scheduling manager with the comfortable informality of someone he genuinely liked. The text read, "You just turned the registers off." He had just turned the registers off. He was standing at Register 4, the last one in the row, confirmation screen still fading on the terminal. He looked at the text for a moment and then called the number. His coworker answered on the second ring, voice carrying the particular texture of someone who had been horizontal for several hours, congested, low, genuinely unwell. He asked if he had just sent a text. His coworker said he hadn't sent anything, that his phone had been on the charger across the room since 6 p.m., that he'd barely moved from the couch. He asked his coworker to check his sent messages. There was a pause, the sound of movement, and then his coworker said there was nothing there. No sent text to his number. Nothing sent in the last 3 hours. He looked at his own phone. The message was there. Timestamped 9:22 p.m. Delivered. Sent from his coworker's number. He told his coworker to keep his phone close and hung up and stood at Register 4 in the empty store and thought about it for a moment. Spoofed number, that was the first explanation, and a reasonable one. Anyone with a spoofing app could send a text that appeared to come from any number. The content of the message was the part that didn't fit that explanation cleanly. Whoever had sent it had known what he was doing at 9:22 p.m. He looked up at the ceiling. There were security cameras at every register, standard retail coverage, visible domes, not concealed. If someone was watching the camera feeds from outside the system, or had found a way into the store's network, they could see him in real time. This was uncomfortable but technically explicable. He went back to the checklist. At 9:41 p.m., a second text arrived from the same number. Now you're doing the aisle lights, starting from garden. He was in the garden section at the first light panel, which was where the aisle shutdown sequence began. The checklist specified starting from garden and working inward. Anyone who knew the store's closing procedure, any current or former employee, anyone who had read the operations manual, would know this. He told himself that. He kept moving. At 10:04 p.m., you stopped at aisle 9. He had stopped at aisle 9. He had stopped because one of the overhead fluorescents was flickering, a tube on its way out, and he had stood for a moment looking at it, deciding whether to log it for maintenance or replace it himself tonight. He had been standing still in aisle 9 for approximately 40 seconds before the text arrived. The flickering light meant he had been stationary, not moving through a predictable sequence, standing in one spot because of something unexpected. And the text had arrived during that pause. He called his coworker again. Same answer, no sent messages. Phone barely touched all evening. He asked his coworker if he had told anyone he was calling in today, if he had mentioned to anyone which store he worked at or who his closing partner was. His coworker said he'd texted the scheduling manager to report the absence that morning. Standard procedure. The scheduling manager had his number because scheduling managers had everyone's numbers. He thought about who had access to the scheduling system. Managers, obviously. Corporate HR. The third-party scheduling software vendor. Anyone who had ever been given manager-level access and hadn't been properly off-boarded when they left. He thought about how many people that might be, across a company the size of the one that ran this store, and the number got uncomfortable quickly. He turned off aisle 9's lights and kept moving. At 10:29 p.m., check the cage in receiving. The lock looks wrong. He stopped walking. He was in the middle of the store. Receiving was at the back, the far end of the building, through the lumber section, past the contractor desk, through the double doors into the receiving bay. He was not in receiving. He was not near receiving. He had not been near receiving since his shift started. For someone watching the ceiling cameras to know he had not yet checked the receiving cage, they would need to know his checklist, which was possible, but to comment that the lock looked wrong, they would need to be able to see the receiving bay. The ceiling cameras in the receiving bay were interior only. They fed to the storage system. There were no exterior cameras that covered the cage from a useful angle. For the lock to look wrong to someone watching remotely, that someone would need to be in receiving. He did not go to receiving. He called the police non-emergency line, standing in the middle of aisle 11, speaking quietly in case quiet mattered. He described the situation, closing alone, text from a coworker's number that the coworker denied sending, content that demonstrated real-time knowledge of his location. The dispatcher asked if he wanted a unit to come by. He said yes. He was told 15 to 20 minutes. He stood in aisle 11 and did not move and watched the far end of the store where the double doors to receiving were a dim rectangle at the edge of his sight. The doors were closed. He could not see whether they were moving. He thought about the 41 steps on his checklist and how step 37 was to physically verify the receiving bay doors were secured from the inside, and how he was not going to do step 37 tonight. At 10:44 p.m., I tried to warn you. He read the text twice. Past tense. Not I'm trying, tried. The word sitting in past tense like something that had already happened, like a door that had already been decided, like the warning had been issued and the window for it had closed. He looked at the receiving doors. They were open. Not wide open. The left door was pushed out several inches from the frame. The gap dark, the receiving bay beyond it unlit. He had not opened those doors. He had not been within 40 feet of them all night. They had been closed, he was certain of that, when he had looked at them 30 seconds ago. He went through the fire exit next to the contractor desk, the one that opened onto the side parking lot, and he stood outside in the cold and waited. He did not go back inside. He left his keys on the ground next to the door, so that when the patrol car arrived the officers could enter without him. He stood in the parking lot and looked at his phone and at the last text and thought about the word tried. The officers swept the building. Took them 22 minutes. They found no one inside. The receiving bay was empty, the cage lock intact, nothing disturbed, no sign of entry from the loading dock or the bay doors. The receiving bay ceiling camera had been covered. A piece of cardboard, cut to fit, pressed against the lens from below, held in place by its own fit against the housing. Not taped, not glued. Just placed there, precisely, by someone tall enough to reach it or using something to stand on, at some point during the business day or after close. The cardboard was gone by the time the officers checked. They found small indentations on the camera housing consistent with something having been pressed against it. Nothing more. He gave his statement in the parking lot. He forwarded the texts to the officer's email. He called his coworker back and told him enough that his coworker understood to change his number in the morning. The store's network security team reviewed the camera access logs the following week. The feeds had been accessed externally that evening through a credential that belonged to a loss prevention manager who had left the company 8 months ago and whose system access had not been revoked. The IP address from which the access had occurred resolved to a public network. The device was never identified. He transferred to a morning shift the following week. He has worked mornings since. He does not work closing shifts and he does not work alone, and when anyone asks why, he says it's a preference, which is true, and that he sleeps better with a morning schedule, which is also true, though the reason he sleeps better has nothing to do with the schedule itself. It is because in the morning the back of every store he has ever worked in is visible from wherever he stands. He knows exactly what is behind him, and the doors are always open and the light is always on and he can see all the way to the end. That was the last one. 7 shifts. 7 buildings. 7 people who went to work and came home carrying something they never asked for and could never quite put down. If these stories found the part of you that checks the back seat before you drive, that pauses at a dark doorway a half-second longer than necessary, then you already know why you're here. This is Black Fears. Subscribe, stay close, and keep the lights on. We'll be back.